Hey viewers, my name's Cara, and this video is actually coming to you from 3 years in the past, sort of, bringing 3 years in the past up to the present and into the future. This video was supposed to be done 3 years ago. It is the final conclusion to my mini-series talking about my experiences at my first witch camp, which happened in fall of 2015. And when I got back, I wrote down a bunch of ideas. I did a couple of videos kind of just saying, hey, I'm back, and then I'm going to be doing a mini-series of videos telling you about my experience. And I had written down the ideas, I had planned out what they were going to be. And there was always meant to be a 6th video in that series that didn't get made. And then every time I went to make it over the past few years, there have been a few times that I've thought maybe now is the right time to make that video. Every time I've gone to do that, the subject, like just through me thinking of it again, came back into my life in such a strong way. And I thought, oh, now I definitely have to talk about this. But by the time it passed and I had my thoughts together, it didn't happen again. So recently on my Patreon, which is patreon.com/cutewitch772, if you don't know, Megan Tonjes and Nicola Fodi describe it as a tipping and rewards site. It's basically a site where you as viewers, as listeners, as consumers and appreciators of creative works can pledge to sponsor individuals or groups doing whatever the work is that they're doing. So you can check it out. There will be a link in my description. But recently, I asked my patrons on Patreon if I should do this video or if it was too late now, if I should just let it go by. And the couple of people who did respond right away said, yeah, I think you should do it. I would love to see that final video. The series has always kind of felt unfinished, and that's because it was always intended to have this final video. So the 6th video in my Witch Camp vlog series was always supposed to be about the overarching theme of working with stories as spirituality, as ritual, and the idea of storytelling, of being a storyteller, and of being a witness to stories, just all of these types of things. So I just want to talk to you a bit about that today. I have a mug of tea with me. It is from the Lizzie Bennett Diaries. A friend actually got this for me. Everyone Deserves Tea is what it says. It's from the Lizzie Bennett Diaries mini-series here on YouTube, which I thought was also appropriate because the mini-series is telling the story of Pride and Prejudice in a more modern way. Pride and Prejudice, of course, is its own separate story, referencing books and books becoming more than that. And also, it's been a long time since I've done a video in front of a bookshelf. Katie Flowers is still doing it, and I saw her new setup recently with the bookcase, and I was like, you know, I really miss that. So let's bring back old YouTube. 3 years ago when I was making this series, it was not in front of a bookcase because I didn't have bookcases already at that point, but here we are. So thinking all the way back to 3 years ago, I've looked through my notes again from camp. I watched the first 5 videos of this series to kind of get back into that feeling again, find out kind of where my head was, knowing that this video is going to be done from the lens of 3 years down the line. How do these things still apply to me? And how are they still growing and expanding and making themselves present in my day-to-day life? But I'm glad that I went back and watched them because it reminded me that actually in the first, actually I think it was before even number 1, it was in my video in this playlist. This video will be in that playlist as well. The video called Transitioning Home. I already told a little bit of this story. So basically what had happened was, after going to camp in the first place, which every witch camp and every little workshop that I've been to so far, yeah, I was going to say except one, but no, every little workshop that I've been to so far within the Reclaiming Tradition of Witchcraft and the camp that I went to and all the camps in general, they are themed around a story. So it begins with, you know, a team, a committee of people. Lots of people suggest stories. Maybe they give a little pitch as to why they think it would be a good story, what kind of angles they think could be worked with in the story. And then whoever's deciding, they decide what story is going to be the theme. And then all of the teachers, all of the ritual organizers and planners, everybody themes the work that is going to be done around that story, around the characters, around the lessons and the morals that can be learned. And so this could be anything. It could be a myth. It could be a folk tale. It could be a fairy tale. It could even be a Shakespearean play, since I happen to be in front of my play shelves here. Anything that is a story can be worked with through ritual and through magic, and can lend itself to the organization of what you're doing. So I talked throughout my series about how when I went to camp, I took the Elements of Magic path, which now, 3 years later, there is now a book out on Elements of Magic that was edited by G'day Parma and Jane Meredith, two Australian reclaiming witches, and it is a collection of writings by many other reclaiming teachers and reclaiming witches, going through many different aspects of the elements that we learn in the Elements of Magic path. And I think that's a really good example, because I mentioned how some people who took the path with me have already been on this path and had been working within the reclaiming tradition for years and years and years, and they were circling back around to come back to basics and take that elements path again. You might take elements 50 times in your life. You might teach elements if you go on to being a community leader or a teacher, as I am in the process of being trained to do. You might teach elements 50 times in your life, but each time it might have a different story as the theme. And so that's where this practice comes in, of really allowing different stories to open up new aspects of those same basic building blocks, that same foundation. So you might always be working with breath, and you might always be working with energy, forming energy and feeling energy in your hands. You might always be working with meditation, trance, spell crafting, all of these basic things. But depending on the story that you're using as the theme, it can really open that up and challenge you even to, you know, whether it's opening it up and expanding it, or it can also be a challenge to limit yourself and say, okay, but I have to make it fit this story. So if there might be 10 different ways to teach breath work, 20 different ways if you've got 2 teachers cooperating on it and they each know 10 different ways, right? It can be a fun challenge and an illuminating challenge to say, okay, but how do we connect it to this story or this particular character? So it can be anything. And so that's just something that I really loved getting into exploring with the reclaiming tradition. Obviously, it's not just reclaiming tradition that is able to do that. Anyone can do that. You don't have to identify with reclaiming. Maybe some people already are working with stories in that way. And if not, and that sounds cool to you, feel free to explore that yourself. But that was just one really cool experience that I had, and I found myself a lot of times during camp actually wanting it to have been even more into the story. You know, like one of the previous videos I did in this series 3 years ago was talking about my affinity group and how we had been given a choice between various animals to decide which one we had an affinity with, and then the other people who had picked that animal became our affinity group, and we had our own private group times throughout the week, and we created our own group ritual together as a smaller group. And some of those people might have been in your same path group, or they might not have. It was just a totally different group based on your affinity with that animal. And I remember when they were first announcing how we would be suggesting it, I really wanted it to be based on characters from the story that we were working with. I thought like, oh, this is such a good opportunity to bring in yet another layer of our affinity with this character. You know, like, just for example, one of my favorite stories always as a child that I then explored more through theater and I wrote some research papers about in college is The Wizard of Oz. So for example, with that, it would have been like the characters that you could choose from would have been Dorothy, the Tin Man, the Lion, the Scarecrow, the Wicked Witch, Glinda, the Munchkins, the Winkies, whoever else. It might even be the Yellow Brick Road, the Ruby Slippers, you know, whatever. I wanted it to be like that, and it wasn't. So I just found myself like really loving the concept and really wanting to just dive in and make it all really themed around that story. Whatever the story is, like I said, sometimes it can be themed around mythology. So sometimes it might be Ariadne and the Minotaur. That was the story of one of the California witch camps in the past few years. I don't know what it is this year. I haven't looked it up yet, or maybe they don't know what it is yet. Stuff like that. So that's a concept that's really cool to me as someone who loves stories, and I actually did take courses back in college about myths, legends, folklore, and fairy tales. That was actually the name of one of the courses. I took it as a freshman, and then I loved it so much that I became the writing assistant for it in my next year when I was a teaching assistant and writing assistant. So I still have some textbooks from that class that are about like why folklore matters and why storytelling matters and why fairy tales stick in our minds and the way that they use really universal concepts and archetypes and things like that. And different stories might have a lot of similarities because they're telling the same basic archetypal tale underneath it all, but the details change, maybe depending on the culture telling the story. I find all of that really interesting. So that aspect, that storytelling aspect of camp really resonated with me. And I also like to describe when people ask me, like, how did I get involved in theater? And why do I love theater so much? For me, it all comes back to that. I think that telling a story is incredibly powerful. And we can even use theater in ritual. Ritual theater is a thing. Acting out mythology and folklore, being able to really, basically invoke that character into your body the way that we might a deity. And so maybe that gets into a little pop culture magic for you. But that is a concept that I think is very cool and makes a lot of sense to me because I see all of these things as different ways of working with archetype and character and telling stories. Beyond all that, though, it doesn't just have to be in a book or in a myth. It's not just a play. Our entire lives are stories, and we are the main character in our story. You might have seen quotes about that floating around the internet. That's a semi-popular thing to say. We are the main character in our own story. Another thing that I've seen floating around that I like to remember and think about every so often is that we might also be the villain in someone else's story, whether or not we think that is totally fair. And that is where we get things like Wicked being written by Gregory Maguire, telling the story of the Wicked Witch, because in The Wizard of Oz, all right, she's the Wicked Witch, she's the bad guy, and Wicked really telling her story from her point of view and everything that she's been through, you know. That's where we get that kind of idea that someone else's story is all about them, and the role that we play somewhat has something to do with what we do, of course. Our actions, our words have meaning, have consequences. But there are also moments where we might not be able to help how someone else casts us in their story, you know? So I personally like to remember that, because I like to think back and reflect on ways that I might have acted in the past and things that I might have said or done to people earlier on in my life that might have ended up casting me as the villain in their story. And now coming to terms with that, saying, how do I improve myself as a person? How do I make sure that I don't do that villainous thing again, you know? And sometimes it might involve actually reaching out to someone and wanting to change that story. So knowing that their internal story, or even external, they might be telling other people. This is like people spreading rumors about you, things like that. Trying to reach out to them and repair that story, that impression that they have of you, so that the story that they tell about you from now on might change. And maybe it won't. But, you know, just thinking about it in that way that, you know, I know there are people about me in my life who have told stories about me that basically I'm the villain. And when I tell that same story, they are the villain because it's subjective and we're both the main character in our own story. But because I work with these types of things, I really try to think like, well, where have I been the villain? Where can I acknowledge that I actually did do something or say something? And how do I change that so that I don't keep doing that in the future? And other instances where I think that is really their subjective interpretation, or that they have ulterior motives for casting me that way in their story. Of course, they want to look like the hero, so they will say that I did or said something that maybe I really didn't. And so choosing my battles, or as we talked about in camp, choosing which stories we will hold. So knowing all of the different stories that people tell about me, knowing all of the different stories that I tell about myself, the things that I repeatedly say about myself are basically stories. Knowing all of those things, the external and the internal stories, choosing which ones I will claim and which ones I will hold on to, and which ones, excuse me, the lighting is really changing right now too. I've got a bright light reflecting off the floor into my left eye, and I just looked up to the screen and realized I'm half in shadow. But deciding which ones to hold close and claim and say, yes, these are mine. These are my stories and they mean something to me. And which ones I will choose to let go and flutter off into the universe. Maybe saying, this story used to be really important to me, but I'm willing to let it go. It doesn't serve me anymore, so I'm willing to let it go. Or realizing, this story isn't mine. This is someone else's story about me. So I'm not going to hold on to it and claim it in my own heart of hearts, but I recognize that this is someone else's story and I'm going to release it back to them. just all that type of stuff. I also wanted to say a little bit more. I know this has been a 20-minute video, but I knew it was going to be long. Let me see if I can switch where my camera is just a second to get that light out of my eye. That'll be better. Cool. I also wanted to say a little bit more about what I talked about in that transitioning home video, which was how the work for that week, that intensive week of living with 50 witches and being in sacred space for an entire week and working with story and practicing and really working on being a witness, how that work during that week affected my life outside of camp when I started to go home. So firstly, the word witnessing is something that we worked on. We did various exercises working on telling our own stories and recognizing the negative stories that we tell about ourselves and, really hearing it come out of our mouths like, oh my God, no wonder this is how my life is. I keep telling myself this story. And if I keep telling myself this, then how can I expect myself to make something else happen if I don't even believe that's true because I'm the one telling this story and I'm not telling it that way, But also working on witnessing other people's stories. And you might have seen people on the internet now, because I've come across this in different groups and communities online where maybe someone will share something in a group and you'll just see people respond and they'll just say one word, witnessed. If you've ever wondered what that means, if that's not familiar to you, that practice, that process, the easiest way I can put it is that it is the process of actively listening to someone else's story with the intention of doing nothing but witness their story. So we're not listening in order to leave a comment under the video. We're not listening waiting for our opportunity to break in and interrupt them and say something. We're not listening in order to find that little tidbit of their story that we can relate to and then say, oh, I really relate to that, and in my life, this is how it has happened. We're not listening with the intention of giving them advice at the end. We're not listening with the intention of trying to help them solve anything, help them change anything. The only intention is to actively listen in order to witness that story. Because sometimes people just need to be heard. We don't always need to receive advice. We don't need to receive an opinion. We don't need to change how it is. We're just telling a story. We are sharing something, or we are offering something, and it just needs to be heard. And that is all the magic that is needed. So that's what the witnessing thing is about. That's the easiest way I can put it, is that you're just listening with no intention of changing it or saying anything about it. You're purely witnessing it happening. So that's something we worked on at camp. That's something that I've worked on in other workshops that I've been to since then, and it's something that I try to work on in my daily life. I was recently talking to someone actually about how my videos have gotten really long because I do have a lot to say about topics and I cannot edit them, so I don't cut things out anymore. At this time, I cannot edit them. And how in the past, some people have complained about my videos, even when they were shorter and edited, have complained about how much I talk. And I was recently talking to someone about how there's this weird perception of how much vloggers really talk, because if we're vloggers, then what we do is talk at a camera. So of course, the amount of time that we're on the screen, we're going to be talking for pretty much that whole time. But that is not a reflection of how much we actually talk in the rest of our lives. I'm a very chatty person, certainly, but I think the people who were complaining about that years ago, It's not something I've heard recently, by the way. Years ago. Yeah, I've been on YouTube for a while. I think that people who see it that way and think like, oh my gosh, this girl talks a lot. The people in her life must be really annoyed because she talks so much. They forget that there are other times in my life where I'm not talking because I'm not making a video. But I am a very communicative person, a very verbally communicative person. And something that I have always worked on in my path is finding that time for the silence. I am by no means uncomfortable with silences. They just don't really make a lot of sense in most vlogging videos, especially when I have so much to say that my videos are already 25 minutes long. If I paused and put silence in between them, we'd be sitting here for an hour, you know? So that's just funny. I recently was talking to someone about that, but witnessing and listening, finding time for silence, and all of those sort of related things are things that have been important in my practice and continue to be. But going back into how it's affected me since camp, and the part that I already touched on in that transitioning home video. So I talked about how when I got to the airport, I was waiting for my gate and I was reading a book and people started striking up conversations with me. And that's not something that always happens to me when I'm at the airport. Usually people are kind of staying to themselves. And so I observed that as I was sitting in the airport terminal, wait at the gate, waiting for our flight to start boarding, more people than usual were striking up conversations with me. And maybe that was because I was in a different area of the country, and customs are different in different areas. Some people are more small talky in different areas of the country than in others. But I also started feeling like, well, maybe it has to do with the fact that I just walked out of a week intensive training where I've been actively working on witnessing other people's stories. And so here I am just sitting here minding my own business, and people are coming up to me and starting to talk to me. I also talked about this in the transitioning home video. When I got on the plane, I was sitting between two people, one of whom just started telling me basically his whole family situation and his whole family life story. Not his life story, but his daughter. And he just started telling me all of this information about his daughter and what was going on with her hopes and dreams and her actions, and how he didn't think she was doing enough to make her dreams come true. And I just thought wow, this is the work. This is witnessing. I have been put here in this situation between two people who then the other person I was sitting next to, I ended up talking with them as well. But this person who just out of nowhere, and he said he was from New York, so I know he was a northerner, and this is the area of the country that's typically seen as a little more reserved and not as much small talky, not as likely to put ourselves out there and tell stories. Present company obviously excluded, but this is a New York businessman, and he was just pouring out this story. And I think at one point he even said I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm telling you all that. And I said, that's okay, And I just started to realize that I was still, even though we do a lot of work to dial down and prepare ourselves for re-entry into everyday life rather than, coming from being in sacred space for an entire week, that I still had that energy about me, that this person just felt comfortable telling me his whole story. And, this might be something that he had been really wanting to verbalize and get out of his body and mind for a long time. But maybe no one in his life is that kind of listener, that he couldn't do that. And so me being a stranger on a plane was a good option for him. Even more so the fact that I had just come from an energetic place of witnessing people's stories. He didn't know that consciously, but that is one of the first experiences that I had with that. And after the point that I made those videos, I continued making those videos about Witchcamp through like May of 2016. But there were several other instances of that throughout the next couple of months. I don't remember all of the details perfectly now because they were 3 years ago. But for example, I remember I did mention in previous videos that I had gone back to my church, where at the time I was still attending a Unitarian Universalist church. I went back to church and someone there started telling me a story. And they did the same thing. Like, they poured out this whole story, and then I just, I just kind of stood there and listened and maybe nodded along, but I wasn't trying to interject anything. And then when they were done, they just kind of took a deep breath and were like, I'm sorry, I don't know why I don't need to take up any more of your time. I'm sorry, you can go. And I was like, that's okay, And there was another time I was at, I think where I worked at the time. I can't remember where I was, but I remember this man's face. It was a very tall man with a bushy beard, and he was wearing like a green and blue and gray. I don't remember if it was a flannel or a sweater. I just sort of see his face and the colors. So I don't remember exactly where I was. Again, it's 3 years ago, and I didn't write this stuff down, so I just have the memory. But it was the same thing where I was just going about my day. This was a stranger. I had never met them before. And I think my name, I introduced myself and my name reminded him of something. Or I looked like someone he knew. And he just started telling me this beautiful, nostalgic story of like someone that he hadn't thought of in 20 years. And he was telling me all about them and everything. And with all of these people, there was always like a moment where when they were done, they snapped out of that headspace and they were like, I don't know why I just told you all of that. It was like, almost like I hypnotized them, but I didn't, But like they snap out of it when they're finished saying what they need to say. And the important thing is that with the witnessing aspect is that you don't stop someone before they reach that point where they know, I am done telling whatever the story is that needed to be told right now. Because if I had interrupted them halfway through, that story wouldn't have finished getting told. And so there were a lot of moments in the few months after I got home from witch camp where every situation that I found myself in, people were just compelled to tell me their stories. I didn't ask them to. I didn't say anything about anything. A lot of the times it was strangers, and it was just something little, like my name or something I was wearing. I briefly mentioned in one of the previous videos in this playlist that I was wearing a necklace that reminded someone of a story, and they started telling me this whole long story. I think that was one of the things that happened at church too. But, it's just like the littlest thing. And I can totally relate to that because the littlest thing reminds me of stories all the time. And I like to tell stories. But, yeah, I just observing how often it was happening after I got back from camp, and specifically the way that every time people would finish and then like almost be surprised that they were able to finish a whole story and I had never interrupted them, and then they were always like, I don't know why I just shared that with you. I don't know why I just did that. And I knew why. And it was just because they needed a witness in that moment, and that was me. So I mentioned that every time I thought about doing this video in the past 3 years, its energy came back up. And what I mean by that is the same thing happened. So that type of thing had started to wear off. A couple months go by, I start really, I was fully transitioned back into my everyday life. Even though I was still doing workshops, I was still doing my own personal work. Some of the fairy dust had kind of, been dusted off, so to speak. So it wasn't happening all the time anymore. But every time I thought about doing this video again, someone would approach me with a story. And the most recent time it happened was yesterday. Yesterday, when I was planning this video, I was about to, excuse me, I have the hiccups suddenly. I was about to start working on this video, so I was in the process of watching the previous videos on this playlist, as I said I did, to try to get back in the headspace and remind myself what I had talked about before. And in the middle of preparing to do the video, a friend of mine messaged me out of nowhere, just diving right into a story, which is how I always prefer to keep my online correspondences. I always tell people, if you have something to tell me, just tell me. Don't feel like you have to start with the pleasantries. Hi, it's been a while. How are you? Because as soon as you ask me how I am, I'm going to tell you a story about how I am, because I don't do the whole, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. How are you? I'm fine. Thanks for asking. Oh, you're welcome. No, like, if you ask me how I am, I'm actually going to tell you how I am. And when I ask someone how they are, I actually want to know how they are. So I tell people, you don't have to go through that every time, because if you have something really pressing that you want to tell me, just go ahead and start telling me, because if you stop to ask me how I'm doing first, I'm going to tell you a whole story, and you're going to have to wait half an hour to tell me what you wanted to tell me. So my friend, knowing how I prefer to have our interactions go, dove right into a story. But I just thought it was so funny, because this is a person who is not usually very talkative about themselves. They'll talk a long time about general topics with me. They'll talk a long time about my life, but you know, there are those people who just don't really like to talk about themselves and what's going on with them. And so I just thought it was so funny. I should have expected it, because again, every time I think about this topic, every time I just think about storytelling and being a witness, it's like I'm right back in that energy, and there are people wanting to tell me their life stories or whatever is going on in their life at that moment. They just have to tell me. So a friend of mine messaged me yesterday, started telling me this big long story, and so in between watching my previous videos to remind myself, I was going back and checking the messages and seeing what else they had said and just, you know, going through it. And so the work of witnessing really is something that has proven a useful thing for me throughout my time since Witchcamp, and also just something that keeps making itself very present in my life. And I really appreciate it, because again, I consider myself a storyteller. I love the magic of stories, whether it's working with stories in ritual or working with stories on stage or reading plays and just getting to embody different characters, but also the inner work aspect of it, of thinking of what are these stories that we are telling about ourselves? What is the negative story that you keep telling yourself that the universe knows is not true, but for some reason you keep telling that story and it's what you're convincing yourself? What are the stories that other people are telling about you that, again, maybe aren't true? Maybe it's a subjective thing, but that you are claiming and just assuming. And I do it a lot. You know, I really do. I really do it a lot. And I think that beginning the work of that kind of recognition of story, of what are my stories that I'm going to claim and hold, and what are the stories that I'm going to release and let go of, that work is really helpful for me, because I do that so much. I hear a story that someone said about me that is a negative story, and I convince myself that everyone in the world thinks it. And possibly the worst thing I can do is convince myself that it's true for me. So storytelling, witnessing, being a witness to so many strangers' stories, just moments that they feel like they really need to tell a story. And again, outside of a spiritual space, outside of a specific ritual circle where we're all there to share our stories and witness each other, when does the general population get to share their stories in such a way? Not always. Maybe just with your absolute best friends, but some people, there are stories you feel like you can't tell to your partner or your spouse or your family, your kids, your teacher, your coworkers. There are instances where stories need to be told and we don't know who to tell them to. And so I think the more of us who can become witnesses in that type of way, the better, because the more opportunities people will have to release those stories into the universe and get them out of their systems or bring them to life in a positive way, depending on what that story is, positive or negative, as they see it. So that will conclude my 3-year-old mini series on my experiences going to my first witch camp in 2015. So thank you for watching. Thank you for waiting all this time. I'm glad to wrap up at least one loose end of the many projects that I always have going on. And I hope that it was useful for you. And I hope that it added just a little bit of depth, coming from that lens of here I am 3 years down the line, and here's how that work has continued to affect me over an extended amount of time. Thank you very much for watching. I will link to the whole playlist here, and I hope you will check it out. And I will also link to reclaiming.org and witchcamp.org in the description. They recently redid reclaiming.org. It looks very shiny and new now. So yeah, you can find more information there, and I'll see you next time. Don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye.